Hello. What I'm going to talk about is, does touch matter? Insights from haptic research and marketing. First, I want to explain what haptics is. Haptics comes from the Greek word, and it means able to lay hold of. Basically, think about it as touching with the hands. And you may think of, well, why do we care about haptics in marketing? If you think about the growth of online shopping or catalog shopping, it's really important to understand why people are more motivated to touch than others, and how do we compensate for an inability to touch. So I'm going to talk about a framework. I'm going to start with object or product factors that encourage touch, and then an individual difference factor, and then situational factors that may motivate touch, and then a little bit about compensation mechanisms. Touch is better than any other sense at 4 different attributes. And those include texture, hardness, weight, and temperature. So for texture, you're going to be motivated to touch this or clothing. For hardness, if you think about a cell phone, you might want to press the buttons and see how they feel prior to purchase. Electronic equipment, too, people like to see how the buttons respond. And then we also have weight. You want to see how heavy it is, how easy it is to carry. And then finally, temperature. So if you're buying a beverage, you may want to feel different beverages to feel the coldest one in the refrigerator. What's really interesting about touch, there are some people in cognitive psychology that have studied touch also. And what they look at is people's hand movements. So for each of those object properties, there's stereotypical hand movements you can observe as they're ascertaining that information. So for example, texture. If you watch people trying to ascertain texture, they will do this lateral motion. They'll rub like this, or they'll rub like this. In one study, I videotaped people evaluating products and timed their different hand movements. So each of these 4 attributes have different hand movements. So we have texture. For hardness, you can see them pressure. So you can see people pushing the buttons, basically. For weight, unsupported holding, you can see them hefting the object. And then finally, for temperature, static contact, you can just see them laying their hands on the different objects. So the haptic perceptual system is really interesting because it's the only system where you can observe input to the system by observing hand movements. So if a product category varies on those attributes, you're going to be much more motivated to touch than if it doesn't. So for example, like books, they don't really vary in a diagnostic way on one of those attributes, so you don't really care about touching, compared to something like clothes or sporting equipment or something else that does. So products vary. People also vary in how motivated they are to touch. So if you watch people in stores, which I've done a lot, and you look at their touching behavior, there are some people, no matter what category they're in, they touch everything, while other people don't really seem to care if they touch or not. So there is this individual difference, which I term need for touch, in people's preference for touch information. So you have the product, you have the people, then situational differences. So online catalog, I already mentioned that you can't touch prior to purchase. In one study, I went to a grocery store, and I kind of hid behind nutrition signs while I watched people shop, and I looked at what categories they purchased in. I timed how long they touched, which categories they touched. One thing that I found is if you put up a point of purchase sign encouraging touch, you get significantly more impulse unplanned purchasing for high and low need for touch people, but especially these high need for touch people. So you can change things in the situation and motivate people to touch even more. So you have the product, you have the individual, and you have the situational factors. But let's say you buy something like this blanket online. Well, this you would say, well, okay, it's soft, texture you could feel, this lateral motion, weight, unsupported holding. It's a product category that you'd probably want to touch. And let's say you're high need for touch. Why would you buy something like that online? Well, it could be that there's some compensation mechanism. So for example, there's some written description where you don't really need to touch it because you can just read the written description. So there could be a written description, there could be a visual, there could be a low price, there could be a return policy, some way to compensate for an inability to touch. So does touch matter? I would say sometimes. It just depends on the product and the person and the situation. Thank you.